assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
To try and channel it for
You will see a procession of
deny what I think is false argument. Free and uncorrupted communication.
One of the individuals who is going to be with us today and throughout this symposium was Robert McNamara. And unfortunately, Mr. McNamara had a very serious accident which required a surgical operation, and he is still recovering from that. But I thought it would be appropriate to just read one of the many things that he's written and spoken about with regard to nuclear weapons as a way of beginning this morning. He has an article that was in Foreign Policy called Apocalypse Soon, and it's well worth reading for particularly all of you young people. I encourage you to get a hold of that and read it. But this quote that I'm going to read comes from that. We are at a critical moment in human history, perhaps not as dramatic as that of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but a moment no less crucial. Neither the Bush administration, the Congress, the American people, nor the people of other nations have debated the merits of alternative long-range nuclear weapons policies for their country or the world. They have not examined the military utility of the weapons, the risk of inadvertent or accidental use, the moral and legal considerations relating to the use or threat of use of the weapons, or the impact of current policies on proliferation. Such debates are long overdue. If they are held, I believe they will conclude, as have I and an increasing number of senior military leaders, politicians, and civil security experts, we must move promptly toward the elimination or near elimination of all nuclear weapons. For many, there is a strong temptation to cling to the strategies of the past 40 years. But to do so would be a serious mistake, leading to unacceptable risks for all nations. Our discussion today, I think, will pick up themes in Mr. McNamara's quotation and reflect the concerns that he expresses. And now I'd like to introduce to you the moderator of our first panel this morning, David Dionisi. He is the Deputy Director of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. Dave.
So this first panel is Standing at the Nuclear Precipice, and I have the honor of introducing our first panel speaker, Dan Ellsberg. And it may surprise you, but Dan Ellsberg was actually a rifle platoon leader back in 1954. Sometimes, people in the peace movement, I find out these things about them, and I for some reason, it shocks me. I'm a former Army officer, and so a lot of us that are in the nonviolent mode working to abolish nuclear weapons have come from this world of the military. But Dan is very famous for having the courage to step forward and release the truth. He's the person that released the Pentagon Papers. This was a 7,000-page document that he photocopied and at great personal expense made known to the world and helped us understand really what was going on in Vietnam. What our world needs now is more Dan Ellsbergs to step forward and share what's really going on in Iraq. So we're very lucky to have Dan here. Ever since the Vietnam War, he's been a very powerful speaker for peace. And with that, I'd like to ask him to come up.
Well, I'm sorry to pull rank on you, David, but I was not only platoon leader, I was a rifle company commander.
I understand.
And you'll appreciate that's a great honor. It's a wonderful command, and if I could have been a rifle platoon leader for my whole career, I might literally well have stayed in. I dreaded the thought that I would become a major eventually and be a staff person, go around doing things I didn't want to do. I used that experience, peacetime experience, having volunteered to stay in the Marine Corps an extra year with the expectation of fighting in the Middle East during the Suez Crisis. And we evacuated 1,500 Americans from Alexandria during that, but we didn't get into combat. But I used that experience as a civilian in Vietnam to work with military, to observe military operations, and to go out on pacification missions, some of which involved combat. So in the end, I saw more combat than I would have seen at the same age if I'd stayed in the Marine Corps. I walked with troops at the point in a way that I could not have done as a major or even a captain. And that was a war that had to be seen up close, if at all, and I did see it up close. Now, I've been thinking about that a lot recently because having had that experience, I know how commonly the potential for courage, physical courage, is spread among very ordinary Americans. People who've been in combat even for a day, or half a day can be enough, have had the experience of seeing people risk their lives in effect routinely, under orders or on their own initiative, saving other members of their team, doing a job, doing what they're told to do under heavy fire, having bullets over your head from both directions. At one point, having experience with 5 other people in a point of moving toward a machine gun nest where you could see the machine gun firing at you, but with a wave of fire over our heads that made me wonder how anybody ever survived friendly fire. You know, you're down on the ground, but this wave of fire is coming right over your heads from behind, and why people aren't shot in the back all the time, I don't know, and I'm sure there's a lot more of it than we ever hear of. So they're doing that. They're moving forward. They're doing what they have to do, or are told to do, showing reserves then of courage and willingness to die for a mission, for their job, and for their friends, that is widely available. I remember my platoon I discovered, was first ashore at Tarawa. I made a poster to that effect. But the division commander, O.P. Smith, at the time said of the whole division, uncommon valor was a common virtue. And that was true. Now, what struck me as a civilian now in the rest of my life is how extremely uncommon courage that is in any way comparable to that is among civilians in the area where these civilians are making choices of life and death, where enormous numbers of lives are at stake, often quite immediately at stake, and where they can see, as in the charge of the Light Brigade, let's say, that missions are extremely ill-conceived and desperate and reckless and foolish, and are going to lead totally uselessly to vast loss of life, whether that's measured in hundreds or thousands or hundreds of millions, as in nuclear war. And yet, the availability of the character of a willingness to sacrifice one's own self for the advantage of people who are endangered by these policies is extremely rare. That seems to be a human, there's a split there, that in combat and in certain other occupations like firemen and firefighters and perhaps police, whereas it isn't hard to find recruits, especially young people, but not all young, who will readily sacrifice themselves and leave their families fatherless or motherless Think of the mothers who were in Vietnam, in Iraq, rather, now having left young children behind to be cared for by step-parents or other people, and taking their lives in their hands every minute of the day. And the people who sent them over there are, and I'll be very concrete, a subset of the people who sent them over believe that they are obeying God's will, but definitely they're doing something good for the country. They believe what President Bush seems to believe, that the war on Iraq serves the war on terror and is protecting people at home. Possibly most soldiers, men and women, go over there with that belief. It's the opposite of the truth, and most people by now have realized that. The people over there, it's a Homeric epithet, are brave soldiers. And I've said, that's not hypocritical. They are brave. But what are they doing? They are endangering every day of their operations their relatives at home. They are increasing the likelihood of terrorism in this country, in the polarization. Their presence in Iraq endangers their families. And every extra week they're there increases that danger. And that's, of course, controversial, but not at all hard to argue for, in favor of. And the people who manage not to believe that seem totally distant from reality. How many of those who perceive it in these terms inside the government are willing to tell us what they perceive and what the official evidence is for that state of affairs? And the answer is, to a good first approximation, none. How do we know there are such people? Two ways. There are a significant number of leaks of anonymous sources who will give that impression at the time, and those are very useful, but haven't made any decisive effect now. But we have very strikingly, with no counterpart in the Vietnam War, we have books like those of Richard Clarke and Mike Scheuer, who wrote under the name Anonymous, but who was readily identified as a CIA high operative named Mike Scheuer, both now who've left the government, who each of whom tells us that at the highest levels, they knew, I'll put it in Mark Clark's terms, that from September 11th and 12th on, and remember Clark was running in the White House the U.S. response to 9/11. Where are the planes coming from? Who should do what, do this? He was in charge as counterterrorism expert. And he tells us now in his book of last year that as of September 12th, he understood from talking directly to Bush and Rumsfeld, quote, these people were going to hijack this tragedy and turn it into an excuse for attacking a country, Iraq, after Afghanistan, Iraq, that had had nothing to do with this event, in circumstances where the attack would be a disaster and would totally undermine the extremely serious war on terror. It would create recruits for terrorists in a way that Al-Qaeda could not possibly do for itself, and which make it impossible to reduce the strength of Al-Qaeda. It would do nothing but increase it. Now, could he have been right? He's thinking this now in September 12th, 2001. The attack is now a year and a half later, early 2003. Could he be right that a policy could be that counterproductive, that foolish, that destructive, that dangerous? That foolish, because the people who were designing this were not foolish people. Bush is, not to be a joke about it, but Bush is a strange man. It's hard to assess his cognitive processes somehow. But Cheney and Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld are, by no standards, dumb people. Feith, to be sure, is described by him as genuinely dumb. But most of these are not dumb people. But we're talking about a policy then that appears to be the opposite of intelligent. Is that possible? Can it turn out that badly, et cetera, et cetera? Could they possibly get away with selling a policy that bad and persisting in it? even after its consequences were obvious. Well, we have the answers to all that now. There's a pattern here that I want to build on. This was not a big surprise to me because the Vietnam decision-making was that bad, and I was part of that, and that obvious from the inside as bad, inscrutable, awful, criminal in many respects, unconstitutional, that successful at its secretiveness, that misunderstood to this day, generally. Most people, I would say, I won't go into it, misunderstand, let's say, Nixon's policy as much as anyone ever misunderstood Bush's policy in Iraq. So they can keep the secrecy and they can get the job done for a terrible policy which is perceived as a terrible policy by many people inside. And yet in Vietnam and Iraq, not one told the public what he or she, mostly he, but some she's, thought or felt they knew about that policy, that disaster. Not one. And I'm included in that. I had that perception in Vietnam. I was not one who informed the Congress or informed the public of where we were going. So I'm not pointing fingers here. I'm talking about a phenomenon that I know very well. The analogy to our main subject today is this. American nuclear policy from 45 on has been as secretive, as formed by a small cabal, let us say, a small group of inside decision makers who kept it secret from their colleagues as well as from Congress and the public, as much so as the secret planning for escalation in Iraq or in Vietnam. The policy was as misguided, as unrealistic, as foolish, and as disastrous by any standards, with the major difference being that the human implications were about 1,000 times worse in each case. We've seen the performance of the government, of this government, in protecting the people of New Orleans. To think that this government is protecting the people of the world and of this country better than they did the people of New Orleans happens to be wrong. Look at Iraq, the decision-making on Iraq. I've already characterized that. If you think of a regime then as to whether it deserves the benefit of the doubt on nuclear matters, think of it as the same regime that did Iraq, same people as Iraq and Katrina, and my assertion from inside that I'm sort of like the person, and there were quite a few, who knew that the deliberate neglect of the wetlands increased the likelihood of the levees being hit, who knew that the levees were misdesigned, who knew that a hurricane of a sufficient force was not improbable at all to do this, who knew that the ground was below level, who knew that there were no buses for the 80,000, who knew all that, and was waiting for these perfect storm to appear. Imagine me as something like that, with one addition, that of course, as I say, the scale is going to be on something like 1 on 1,000. In other words, it occurred to me last night, the slogan, "We all live in New Orleans." We all live in the lowlands of New Orleans. We live on the slopes of Pompeii, and we have done so since 1960, and for 60 years. And I don't know how many people in Pompeii fully understood what they were doing, but we know what happened to them and how they were caught. The immediate, I'm almost finished with my time here, but I can sum up from the title of my talk. I said it's out of the closet. We are facing a precipice in many ways. It's, as some of you heard me say last night, it's not the first time I thought we were on a precipice or that we actually were on a precipice. Sometimes I was mistaken, sometimes I wasn't, but it's not the first, but it differs, and to define exactly what it is a little challenging. Most of the aspects of it are really not new. in terms of policies, there is a mistaken belief that the Bush has changed actual policy much more than he actually has. What has changed is rhetoric. What has changed is the description of policy. And in that respect, we've come out of the closet. We have revealed plans for preemption, for first use, for first strike, for selective proliferation and selective non-proliferation, for helping India on the one hand and opposing Iran on the other hand, for tolerating North Korea and proposing preventive war against Iraq. All these policies, the incoherence of that policy is out in the open now, but it's always been there, in fact, though little known. Empire, we didn't just become an empire, but we're out of the closet on it. We are now proclaiming empire in a way that was not done. Torture, we have managed torture and death squads for half a century or more, actually going well back to the Philippine War, to our earlier imperial operations, not to mention the Indians. But we did it through proxies on the whole. We did it in El Salvador, Guatemala, Indonesia, Brazil, Argentina, through proxies with Americans present. The victims didn't feel much difference, and they were generally aware of the American involvement, but the American people were kept ignorant of it. What's the difference now? Thanks to video cameras and whatnot, we've seen Americans actually doing this. And it's getting accepted, pretty much. So out of the closet, we're a torture state. Soon, it will be known we are a death squad state. That is almost certain to follow. On the question of nuclear war, as I say, very little has actually changed there. Doesn't it make a difference to be open? It does seem to have an ominous aspect to it. The fact that they thought they could get acceptance for it and are getting acceptance for it is extremely ominous when it comes to hope for change. Those of us who were aware of all this before could still hope if only the public knew. It's the counterpart to if only the Tsar knew. And I got out of that mood at a certain point in '69 when I read the Pentagon Papers, learned that every president had heard the critical and skeptical warnings that I and others were giving about the Vietnam War, and they'd all overruled them. So it didn't do any work. So I turned to the public in hopes that if the public only knew, they'll make a change. And that's a disillusioning turn on the whole. I still do, and up here, I still do hope and believe that if the human species can get out of the hole dug for it by, in the first instance, the Eisenhower administration, which built the machinery for knowingly and deliberately killing immediately 500 million people, killing 500 to 600 million people quickly. They built the entire machinery for that in the 50s under Eisenhower, the public little knowing that. Actually, that machinery would have had an inadvertent effect. Nuclear winter, which could have killed everyone, and was likely to kill not 500 million, but several billion people if we'd followed the very plans that I worked on, and no one knew that for another 20 years. But what they did know was the effects of 500 million to 1 billion. Okay, if we're to change that, I still have a feeling that the best hope is for the publics of the world to have a real grasp of what they're facing, to understand the situation as well as most people are now able to understand the quagmire, the horrible situation in Iraq, which is not based on tremendous misunderstanding at this point, I would say. In there, we've learned enough about it, but they don't know about the Iraq. What that takes then is civic courage in the way of revealing to the public what bosses don't want known, men and women who are willing to risk or give up their clearances, their careers, their support to their children's education, if that's an issue, and risk prison. in order to inform the public of what has been wrongfully withheld from them. No one has done that. The closest to it is Mordecai Vanunu, who told what he knew about the Israeli nuclear program, which was quite a bit. He didn't know plans, but he knew a lot about the weapons. He went to prison for 18 years, 11 and a half in solitary, a very high price. And by the way, has almost nothing to show for it in the way of political consequence. No discussion really raised. The secrecy still effective in Israel. Yet, does he regret doing that? He's on trial right now for talking about it, for continuing to repeat it. This week, by now, right now, I mean this week. He's being tried for talking to foreigners. He doesn't regret it. He would do it again. I know he would do it again. And for talking to foreigners, he is likely to go back to prison after 11 and a half years in solitary, the longest sort of a Guinness Book of Records experience. And he's ready to go back. I don't think he's unique in his capabilities. What we need is what we could have had, I think, under Gorbachev if he'd stayed, a nuclear glasnost that would let the people know. David told me this morning, something I'd never heard, that a poll shows that most Americans think, it'd be interesting, should we do a little poll here? What's the best guess here of the number of weapons the U.S. now has operational? Nuclear weapons. Anybody have a suggestion among the younger people, especially? Just make a guess. What?
Roughly 5,500.
Mm-hmm. Well, anybody, I'll tell you, the majority, I won't take time now to go through it, the majority said in the poll thought it was under 200. Now that's living in a different planet, but it doesn't really surprise me. So possibly if somebody could take the step of doing what I wish I had done in 64, 65, instead of what I did in 69 or 71. In 69, I gave 7,000 pages to the Senate. They did nothing with it. In 71, I didn't have too much fear of going to prison from that. In 71, I did give the 7,000 pages to the 19 different newspapers. I did expect to go to prison for that, and I faced 115 years. But it was only history and did not have the effect, and I didn't expect it to have the effect that it might have had if I'd given the same material in 64 when it was current. If I'd done that. No one has really done that on a large scale, although some important leaks have been made. And I'll close with the thought, I mentioned Dick Clark, who gave us this news last year, to his credit, usefully, that he could have given years earlier, in 2001 or 2002. I believe that a Clark or a Scheuer or half a dozen others that I could name could have prevented this war if they'd been willing to risk their clearances and their careers and go to prison. It seems to me, having seen men in combat make decisions far more lethal than that, dangerous, with hardly a moment's thought, it should be possible to demand of civilians and others that they could make comparable, courageous moves for the good of humanity. And I think nothing less than that will move us off the course toward the precipice and over where we're now headed. Thank you.
Okay, we'll continue our first panel, Standing at the Nuclear Precipice, with Jackie Cabasso. And Jackie's talk is titled, Still Standing at the Nuclear Precipice After All These Years, Why? A Critical Look Back at the 1990s. And Jackie has been a voice for the abolition of nuclear weapons for a long time. She's served as the executive director of the Western States Legal Foundation since 1984. She chairs the coordinating committee of the multi-issue People's Nonviolent Response Coalition, which was formed in response to the September 11th attacks. She's also an author. She's written a book titled Risking Peace, Why We Sat in the Road, an account of the huge 1983 nonviolent protest at the Lawrence Livermore Labs. And she's just one of these just amazing people who has, over the last couple of decades, been ringing the bell for us to wake up. So with that, I'm very honored to have her comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Last August marked the 60th anniversary of the illegal and barbaric United States atomic attacks on innocent civilians. Let me repeat that. The illegal and barbaric United States atomic attacks on innocent civilians. How different it sounds from the earnest, passive voice we've come to expect or even to utter ourselves as we gather each year to commemorate the anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Whenever I hear that phrase, I'm struck by the utter lack of accountability ascribed to the source of those anonymous weapons of mass destruction. We all learned about the Nazi Holocaust in high school, yet even today, the U.S. atomic bombings of Japan are not widely taught in our public schools. As the mayor of Hiroshima told the International Court of Justice in 1995, history is written by the victors. Thus, the heinous massacre that was Hiroshima has been handed down to us as a perfectly justified act of war. As a result, for 50 years, we have never directly confronted the full implications of this horrifying act for the future of the human race. Hence, we are still forced to live under the enormous threat of nuclear weapons. In this era of messaging and reframing, I would like to suggest some new themes. First, there was more than one Holocaust in World War II. In 2 blinks of an eye, over 200,000 human beings were sentenced to death by nuclear weapons dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki by U.S. bombers. By the end of 1945, approximately 210,000 men, women, and children had perished, incinerated in an instant, or incomprehensibly, slowly and painfully dying from ghastly radiation burns, unable to eat or drink, their hair falling out in clumps, their skin hanging from their bones like shreds of fabric. Delayed effects continue to this day. Those who survived live daily with the memory of hell on earth. Nothing could have justified those bombings. The United States should take responsibility for its heinous crimes and apologize to the people of Japan. Second, nuclear weapons are the only true weapons of mass destruction. U.S. doctrine lumps nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons together, labeling them all as weapons of mass destruction. But chemical and biological weapons, while unspeakably terrible, immoral, and illegal, are subject to the whims of weather and terrain and difficult to deliver in sufficient quantities to kill many thousands of people. Nuclear weapons, in contrast, are orders of magnitude more destructive. One nuclear weapon is a holocaust. There are still nearly 30,000 of them in the world, enough to destroy human civilization in a day. Equating nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons is one way the U.S. is lowering the threshold for nuclear use. Third, terrorists already have nuclear weapons and are making plans to use them again. More than 15 years after the end of the Cold War, the United States, the only country that has used nuclear weapons in war, maintains a nuclear arsenal of some 10,000 warheads. It is the only state with nuclear weapons on foreign soil. More than 1,500 U.S. strategic nuclear weapons remain on hair-trigger alert, ready to instantly target locations around the globe upon receiving a few short computer signals. The threatened first use of nuclear weapons, even against countries that don't have them, is official U.S. policy at the highest level. Fourth, if you build it, they will come. In a famous line from the movie Field of Dreams, the protagonist declares, "If you build it, they will come." He was talking about a baseball field and the sports fans it would attract. In the same way as we're now seeing all too clearly, if you build a new nuclear weapons infrastructure, it will produce new nuclear weapons. Based on close observation and analysis of developments at our local nuclear weapons labs, some of us were warning of this as early as 1993. Fifth, national security is endangering our human security. After touring the destruction left in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, Mississippi Governor Haley Barbour said, "I can only imagine that this is what Hiroshima looked like 60 years ago. Yet as horrific as the hurricane and flooding were, the damage and suffering they caused pale in comparison to the effects of a nuclear explosion, a 100% preventable man-made event." As the disaster of Hurricane Katrina continues to unfold, it is clear that our national priorities have run drastically off course. Katrina is a metaphor for massive government ineptitude, neglect, and racism. Katrina also illustrates that there could be no adequate response to the far larger catastrophe of a nuclear explosion in a city anywhere. It is unconscionable that in the name of national security, the U.S. government is spending hundreds of billions of dollars on nuclear weapons and war, while utterly failing to meet our human security needs. The U.S. is modernizing every weapon type in its still vast nuclear arsenal, in some cases giving them new or enhanced military capabilities. The 2007 National Nuclear Security Administration budget request confirms that life extension programs to render the U.S. arsenal reliable for decades to come are underway for the B-61 bomb, the W-76 sea-launched ballistic missile, and the W-80 cruise missile. The budget's official policy guidance is the 2001 Nuclear Posture Review, widely dismissed by arms control analysts as a mere wish list when it was leaked to the New York Times. With the stated goal of establishing a nuclear weapons infrastructure responsive to future needs, the proposed budget provides increased funding for the Reliable Replacement Warhead Program, explicitly intended to redesign and replace the entire U.S. nuclear arsenal. Under this program, virtually every warhead component will be redesigned, most likely including the physics packages, the spherical plutonium cores commonly referred to as pits. To this end, funding is provided to produce 30 to 40 new plutonium pits a year at the Los Alamos lab. Meanwhile, something like 12,000 pits from dismantled weapons languish at the Pantex plant in Texas, available for reuse if desired by the weaponeers. And just for good measure, the budget provides for demonstrating the ability to produce tritium, radioactive hydrogen, the H in H-bomb, by 2007. At the same time, the Pentagon is poised to begin development of a new generation of long-range delivery systems capable of carrying either conventional or nuclear warheads. The Air Force has recently issued a prompt global strike request for information, beginning the process of examining alternatives for new weapons capable of hitting targets anywhere on Earth. Supporting materials state that the prompt global strike analysis of alternatives will examine a range of systems concepts to deliver precision weapons with global reach in minutes to hours. That's a quote. Such systems, intended primarily to increase the already overwhelming U.S. advantage in conventional weapons, could at the same time provide the building blocks for new nuclear capabilities, particularly in combination with the warhead modifications underway. Including warheads and their means of delivery, it is believed that the U.S. is spending about $40 billion a year on its nuclear forces, more than the entire military budget of nearly every other country in the world. Nuclear weapons provide the ultimate backup for U.S. conventional forces operating around the world, and they have, in fact, been more fully integrated into U.S. conventional war planning, as evidenced by Strategic Command's recently expanded portfolio. Nuclear weapons are gaining legitimacy as the world's only remaining superpower blurs the distinction between nuclear and conventional weapons and expands the role of nuclear weapons in its national security policy. After 60 years of non-use, it is uncertain whether these developments should be interpreted as dramatically lowering the political threshold for U.S. nuclear weapons use. What is unquestionably different now is that the U.S. is prepared to initiate aggressive wars with elevated risks of unintended consequences, including the creation of situations in which nuclear weapons might be used. Consider this too. Who would have believed 10 years ago that torture would be official U.S. policy and hundreds of people would be detained indefinitely without trials at Guantanamo? And those with first-hand memories of hell on earth are dying off. As the war in Iraq rages on with mounting casualties, a country in ruins, and the poorest in the U.S. facing drastic cuts in vital services, Washington has turned its sights on Iran, seeking again to inflame public fears of a new public threat. With the risk of nuclear weapons climbing towards levels not reached since the darkest days of the Cold War, where's the public outcry? What happened to the massive anti-nuclear movement of the 1980s? Why has the anti-war movement been so quiet about nuclear weapons? When the Cold War abruptly ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, activists, ordinary Americans, and people around the world breathed a huge collective sigh of relief, hoping and believing that they had walked away from a nuclear holocaust and putting nuclear weapons out of their minds. Many activists went on to other issues. Others went back to their day-to-day lives, raising families and working to make ends meet. Meanwhile, deeply embedded in the military-industrial academic corporate complex, the nuclear juggernaut rolled on, as militarists in the Pentagon and the scientists at the nuclear weapons labs conjured up new justifications to project the nuclear weapons enterprise far into the future. In 1992, Colin Powell, then chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, complained, "We no longer have the luxury of having a threat to plan for." In the early 1990s, non-proliferation, stopping the spread of nuclear weapons, was turned on its head. The new buzzword was counter-proliferation, including the threat of a nuclear strike to dissuade other countries from even thinking about developing nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons that could threaten the United States or its allies. During the 1990s, nuclear weapons, especially U.S. nuclear weapons, fell off the public's radar screen. As the Dr. Strangeloves at the nuclear weapons labs got back in the saddle, questions of nuclear arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament became increasingly isolated from issues of concern to most ordinary people, including issues of war and peace, and increasingly relegated to elite policy circles inside the Beltway. This trend was exacerbated when a number of national organizations that had worked on nuclear weapons issues moved their headquarters to Washington, D.C., some even closing their field offices. Credentialed experts redefined post-Cold War priorities almost solely in terms of securing Russian loose nukes and keeping them out of the hands of rogue states and terrorists. Meanwhile, independent grassroots groups monitoring their local nuclear weapons facilities were documenting and trying to put the brakes on U.S. plans to replace full-scale underground nuclear tests with a new generation of high-tech experimental lab facilities and supercomputers, and proposals for new weapons production processes and capabilities. For the most part, this information was kept out of Washington, D.C. discourse by arms control lobbyists, protecting their access to policy and decision makers. As viewed from the corridors of power, apparently, it was desirable to dismiss the fact that nuclear weapons research and development was going forward, while overlooking evolving counterproliferation policies reliant on credible U.S. nuclear threats. To make matters worse, as the decade wore on, funding for NGOs working for arms control and disarmament began to dry up, and those funders still in the field increasingly withdrew support for independent grassroots groups advocating for the abolition of, rather than U.S. control of nuclear weapons. I'm going to take about 2 more minutes. Unchallenged by the arms control community and oblivious to calls for disarmament, the Clinton administration squandered the historically unprecedented opportunity that appeared with the end of the Cold War. Clinton's 1994 Nuclear Posture Review was a blueprint for nuclear weapons business as usual. It was the Clinton administration that in the mid-90s brokered the Faustian bargain to replace full-scale underground nuclear testing with the Stockpile Stewardship Program, at that critical juncture making the decision to massively reinvest in, rather than begin to dismantle, the nuclear weapons research and production infrastructure. Clinton's 1997 Presidential Decision Directive 60 reaffirmed the threatened first use of nuclear weapons as the cornerstone of U.S. national security and contemplated an expanded role for nuclear weapons to deter nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons. And Clinton signed legislation making deployment of a national missile defense system U.S. policy. Indeed, the Clinton administration laid the groundwork for the Bush administration's unilateral and aggressive foreign policy in which the potential use of nuclear weapons is being openly considered. If you build it, they will come. Thwarted in the national arena, U.S. disarmament groups gravitated towards international forums. They found at the month-long 1995 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review and Extension Conference that the U.S., backed by a consortium of well-funded American arms control groups, was demanding indefinite, unconditional extension of the treaty. Tensions were high during the 1995 NPT conference, as many non-nuclear states expressed their dissatisfaction with the lack of progress towards disarmament by the nuclear weapon states. They stressed the mutually reinforcing nature of the disarmament and non-proliferation obligations and warned that an international system of nuclear apartheid was not sustainable. Frustrated and dismayed that the arms controllers were avoiding the D word, disarmament, dozens of NGOs from around the world adopted a comprehensive nuclear disarmament platform calling for the definite and conditional extension of the NPT and immediate commencement of negotiations on a verifiable treaty to eliminate nuclear weapons, with the treaty to be completed by the year 2000. By the end of the conference, hundreds of groups had signed the Abolition 2000 Statement, and the Abolition 2000 Global Network to Eliminate Nuclear Weapons was born. Today, more than 2,000 groups in over 90 countries are affiliated with Abolition 2000, and the founding statement is more relevant than ever. In the run-up to the U.S. attack on Iraq, premised in part on the wholly unsubstantiated claim that Iraq had an active nuclear weapons program, a new anti-war movement began to coalesce with a heightened sensitivity to the domestic impacts of the war on terror. The First National Assembly of United for Peace and Justice, held in Chicago 2003, seemed like a good opportunity to reclaim nuclear disarmament as a peace and justice issue and to reintegrate it into the broader anti-war movement. A proposal from U.S. Abolition 2000 groups to make nuclear disarmament a UFPJ priority was adopted with little discussion or controversy. It was striking, however, that several delegates voiced objections to the effect that nuclear disarmament is the Bush agenda. This turned out to be the tip of an iceberg, exposing a vast lack of awareness in the new anti-war movement about post-Cold War realities of U.S. nuclear programs. And it marked the beginning of a continuing internal education process in UFPJ, the largest anti-war coalition in the country, with over 1,300 groups. Because I'm running out of time, I'm going to just summarize my ending, and I invite you to read my paper, which has a lot more details in it. But on the 59th anniversary of the U.S. atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki initiated an emergency world mayors campaign to eliminate nuclear weapons and launched their 2020 vision, sort of reprising the Abolition 2000 theme. In the run-up to the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference last year, more than 500 mayors from 32 countries, 65 of them in the U.S., had signed on to the mayor's statement. And on May 1st, Abolition 2000, in partnership with United for Peace and Justice, organized a mass march and rally in New York City under the slogan, "End the war in Iraq, abolish all nuclear weapons, no nukes, no wars." The banner is over there. 40,000 people marched past the UN headquarters in New York, filling more than 13 city blocks. And this, we think, was a real breakthrough. On September 26th last year, I was arrested in front of the White House after a weekend of massive protests. Thank you. It was about my 50th arrest. But anyway, we were nonviolently demonstrating without a permit against the war in Iraq. And as I languished in a holding cell with several Gold Star mothers, who were women who had lost their sons and daughters in Iraq, I was again reminded of the Hibakusha and their message. What happened to us is so terrible. It must never happen to anyone again. I just will close with a quote from Lewis Mumford, a great humanist social critic, who said something in 1946 that resonates today, I think, as much as ever. You cannot talk like sane men around a peace table while the atomic bomb itself is ticking beneath it. Do not treat the atomic bomb as a weapon of offense. Do not treat it as an instrument of the police. Treat the bomb for what it is, the visible insanity of a civilization that has ceased to worship life and obey the laws of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Our next speaker is another military person, Colonel Alan Parrington. It's pretty obvious he's an Air Force person, too. His talk is U.S. Defense Strategy at the Nuclear Precipice. He is a senior fellow at the Institute for Globalization and Security at the Graduate School of International Studies, the University of Denver. He has a very, very long resume, as you can imagine, as a colonel. One of the things that you might find interesting is an F-15 pilot and an F-4 pilot with over 4,000 hours. So please come on up.
Good morning. Thank you, David. at a heavy time like this, I'd like everybody, particularly young people, to stand up and just kind of move around for a second so I can kind of get you in the right frame of mind, because what I want to say to you might surprise you. And I'll keep talking as you exercise a little bit, and then when you feel comfortable, sit back down. But I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be here in Southern California in the middle of the winter, particularly from snowy Colorado, in one of my favorite towns, discussing a subject of which we all share a vision and a passion, and that of nuclear disarmament. In fact, when Dr. Krager emailed me and invited me to this, I thought I'd been invited to the West Coast version of the European Union heaven. Now, the idea of an EU heaven was something going around the diplomatic circuit in London a few years ago, about the time the euro came out. And it was one of these positivist, constructivist ideas where that everything could be made just right. In EU heaven, all the chefs were French. All the lovers were beautiful tanned Italians, and all the police were the friendly English bobbies. It was all designed by German car engineers and run with precision by railroad people out of Switzerland. And then David gave me the bad idea, or bad news, after I'd accepted the invitation. He told me that as a military man and a man from a a red state, conservative, I'd be speaking to a group of intellectuals and lawyers and peace activists from the blue states. I began to get a little bit nervous. In fact, I started thinking I might have been invited to the EU hell, where things are very similar, but in EU hell, all the rules are changed. Now the cooks are British. The lovers are Swiss mountain men. The police are the former Gestapo agents. And it's all designed by those folks from Paris who are working on their fifth, or is it sixth republic by now? And of course, it's run on the timetable of the Italian trains. So I got a little bit nervous. And in fact, I told David, I said, well, maybe you've got me mixed up with my friend, professor over at the law school, Vednanda, who is president of the World Jurist Association, one of the associate directors here. But he said, no, he wanted my military point of view, and that's what I'm going to speak to it about today. So I went over and I talked to Professor Nanda, whom I took a course from several years ago, and I said, what do I do? I'm speaking from a totally different point of view. And he said to me, Alan, go and read Grotius, the father of international law, the 17th century philosopher and lawyer and diplomat. In fact, he sent me over his paper. It was, I think it was called The Laws of War and Peace, which became kind of the forerunner of why we're here today. And he said in it, when I read it, when great minds at different times and in different places affirm the same thing as certain, they must draw a correct conclusion from the principles of nature or common descent. So he said, go read the philosophers, the historians, the poets, the orators, so that you can draw this common thread. And that's what I did. So I went over to the bookstore and got out International Relations and Political Thought. It's a book from Cambridge University. And this book, just reading the table of contents made me feel smarter. I mean, this contains the most famous works of the 50 most famous philosophers of all times of the last 2,500 years. Aristotle, Plato, Eusebius, Augustine, Dante, Thomas Aquinas, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Montesquieu, Kant, even a couple of Islamic folks such as Al-Farabi. And I did, as Grotius said, I went through and I read this book trying to draw some common thread between each of these individuals so that I could, as they like to say in Washington these days, connect the dots. Now, maybe I flew fighters for too long, pulled too many G's, sat nuclear alert too long, got around too many nuclear weapons and got some of those gamma rays. But I could only come up with two threads of thoughts in this entire book that connected all these people. They all talked about God, and they all talked about war. Now, I'll leave that first subject alone, having already discussed heaven and hell, but I'll address the second subject. And to be honest with you, I was quite surprised by what I found. As a military man, I rather expected all these guys were Cal Berkeley types, over on the left side of the equation, where I was over on the right side of the equation. In fact, I didn't find that they were. To quote the editors, while none of the ancient writers wholly approved of war or thought that it could not be fought in more or less just ways, virtually no ancient writer considered it by definition wrong to use lethal force in politics. Even the early Christian writers, such as St. Augustine, who thought war to be a sin at its roots, actually found place for defensive wars and wars to correct grave injustices. The Renaissance writers added in the idea that you could have just wars, as the just war theory by Thomas Aquinas. And then the Enlightenment writers, who I would have thought would have really been on the left end of the spectrum, gave us rules of conduct in war, such that by the time you put them all together, you come up with almost Edmund Burke, the 17th century British philosopher, who summed them up when he wrote, "As to war, if it be the means of wrong and violence, it is the sole means of justice among nations. Nothing can banish it from the world. Those who say otherwise, intending to oppose upon us, do not impose upon themselves." But then he adds the kicker. "But it is one of the greatest objects of human wisdom to mitigate those evils we are unable to remove." And that seems to be the bottom line of all the philosophers I read, who, while acknowledging war as a necessary evil, place severe restrictions on the justification of going to war, jus ad bellum, and the rules once you were there, jus in bellum. For example, Hegel wrote, "For war accordingly entails the determination of international law such that it should preserve the possibility of peace, so that, for example, ambassadors should be respected, and war on no account should be waged on either internal institutions and the peace or the privacy of the family life, or on private individuals." Now, when we look today what has gone wrong in the nuclear age, I would submit it's this last piece of the puzzle that we've gone wrong on. Nuclear weapons and strategies that support them violate the most fundamental rule that all the philosophers taught, and that is to make war limited and only between soldiers rather than peoples. Learning how we got here is probably the most important step that we can go to next. And while we'd like to argue it as a blue state, red state sort of thing, and that it's the Bush administration or the Clinton administration or past administration have done it, my research for the Air Force took me back to discover I think it occurred at World War I. Now, World War I, the Great War, the war to end all wars, as Woodrow Wilson said, was one of those great watersheds in history where human history tends to change. It's reported to be the most studied event in human history. Not only did World War I end the rule of monarchs in Europe and lead to the creation of the Soviet Union and bring America on the world stage, more importantly, World War I marked a change in the causes of war and our responses to that. No longer were major wars to be fought between armies over territories and resources, as in the previous 5 centuries. Now ideological disputes became the center of attention, as brought out by Samuel Huntington in his Clash of Civilizations. Fascism versus liberalism, capitalism versus communism, and more recently globalism versus particularism or fundamentalism or whatever you have, took center stage at the political Olympics, and the militaries changed their focus from defeating other militaries to defeating other peoples and their ideas. Air power strategists, of which I'm part of that legacy, in the 1920s and 30s, claimed that we could even avoid wars by avoiding the trench warfare of World War I and taking the fight directly to the cities where the people lived. It was argued that a few hundred bombs placed in strategic locations would so disrupt the economy, the people would rise up and force their government to sue for peace. It was even argued that if you added weapons of mass destruction, in this case chemical weapons, to the mix, you could deter wars from ever happening. Well, World War II put all these hypotheses to the test, and when it was over, the bombing advocates said that they had been victorious and decisive. But the facts were quite the opposite, as our own United States strategic bombing surveys found. The bombing had only made things worse. The people didn't lose their will to fight. Their will got stronger. Now, I don't know how many of you saw the movie The Fog of War, 11 Lessons from the Life of Robert S. McNamara, but if you didn't see it, go down to Blockbuster today and buy it. Show it to your friends and family, and better yet, send it to your congressmen and senators. And pay particular attention to lessons 4 and 5 in there about the strategic bombing of Japan. Now, we all in this room think of the strategic bombing of Japan as Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we should, and those were horrific events which we all should detest and object to. But it actually started long before that. In late 1944, as Lieutenant Colonel McNamara said at the time, he was a chief advisor to the Chief General Curtis LeMay, We went in there at high altitude with B-29s looking for military targets with the idea of making the Japanese surrender so that we would not have to invade. After 3 or 4 months of that, and failed policies for different reasons, all of a sudden General May said, let's go in at low altitude, load them up with incendiary bombs, just as we've done in Germany. And we went in with thousands of airplanes at low altitude, specifically after the Peoples. On the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945, we sent thousands of airplanes over the southeast district of Tokyo and killed over 100,000 people on that one night. And as Secretary McNamara later pointed out, we did that to 65 more cities, destroying between 50 and 90% of the largest 65 cities of Japan. It was a small step from there to Hiroshima. Now, you can say, well, that saved American lives, and that was the argument that Franklin Delano Roosevelt made and Truman made. But the fact was, our own studies showed after the war that the resistance didn't decrease, it went up. And as one Rhodes Scholar put after the war, the Tokyo fire convinced the Japanese lower classes, as no propaganda ever could, that surrender was indeed out of the question, and that Americans really were demons bent on exterminating all Japanese. The Japanese responded, not by decreasing their will, not by giving in to us. They responded with kamikaze tactics and banzai charges, and our casualties went up on Okinawa. And on Okinawa, in April of 1945, we lost more people than did the Japanese for the first time in that war. Now, all these things, unfortunately, have been swept under the carpet, and we haven't learned the lessons of our own campaigns for which we expended a lot of men and material. Now, the title of the movie was called The Fog of War, and it's taken from the most famous book on war ever written by Karl and Clausewitz. It's handed out to every senior military man in this country, taught at all the war colleges, at all the universities, and at all the military academies. And he said it in there, and he used the old Enlightenment phrase of using the human metaphor, which is Plato's metaphor, of trying to explain what he meant. And he said, war is this. It's a struggle between two opponents. And our objective, in his most famous line, is to make the enemy accept our political will. And that all wars are about political objectives carried out by other means. But he said this, he said, the way we do it is to disarm the enemy, and he said it over 120 times during the book. And the only way to do this is to disarm the enemy. Strategic bombing and nuclear weapons does the opposite. It goes after the peoples in the violations of what the philosophers taught. And in the process, as Clausewitz warned, it destroys the political objective. For he said this, and I'll close with this. War is really a strange trinity comprised of three components: the political objective for which you go to war, the means by which you choose, and the social passions which it engenders and causes in the people. He said, like a strange table, almost like a magnet between three poles, you have to keep them all in balance. And if you let one get out of the way, the whole thing will collapse. And that's what we have done in strategic bombing and what we've done with nuclear weapons. We've so inflamed the social passions that all the reasons you go to war get brushed aside. Does anybody remember what the 4 things, or maybe it was 5 things, I don't remember myself, what bin Laden wanted before 9/11? Does anybody care after 9/11? It's so inflamed our passions that the political objectives where we was after have been swept completely aside. Yet that is the same lesson we have failed to learn. The answer to all this is to go back and relearn the philosophers' teachings, to relearn what Sun Tzu and people like Clausewitz said, and to not brush it aside as some militarism or anything else, but to learn and correct our strategies. Because, to be honest with you, after having studied this for 20 years for the Air Force, it's not the nuclear weapons that are the problems. It's we people and our strategies that threaten us all. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. David Kreger, and his talk is Turning Away from the Nuclear Abyss. I'd like to share with you a few things that are not on his standard bio. He's also a former military person. He had the courage to be a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War. And I think that speaks volumes, and we need a lot of people who are in the military right now that have that kind of courage. He's the author of many books. He's been interviewed around the world. He's one of the leading voices for the abolition of nuclear weapons. He's been the president of the Nuclear Age Foundation since 1982, which is the year in which we were founded. And one other thing I'll share with you, when I went over his house the first time, I noticed a picture in his, he has a room for his grandchildren, of him fighting Chuck Norris. He used to be a karate expert and actually beat Chuck Norris at one point, so that's kind of neat. So with that, I'll bring David up.
Unfortunately, though, my grandchildren don't know who Chuck Norris is. I want to talk about turning away from the nuclear abyss. And I take it as a given that we are at the nuclear precipice, or we're very close, and we're certainly on the path. And if we continue on the path we're on, we will go over the nuclear precipice yet again, and with catastrophic results. I believe that Albert Einstein had it right when he said we must change our thinking. And I've thought a great deal about what that change in thinking needs to be. First of all, I think that it's very important to reconceptualize what nuclear weapons are. They're often looked at now as being a tool of power and prestige. And I remember those extraordinary street scenes when India and Pakistan tested their nuclear weapons, and ordinary people by the tens of thousands appeared to be celebrating in the streets this so-called achievement in the land of Gandhi. In the land of Gandhi. But what are nuclear weapons, and how do we need to think about them? I think that from the perspective of any faith, such weapons that destroy indiscriminately have to be considered immoral. And the International Court of Justice and customary international law has made it clear that they are also illegal. But these concepts aren't widely discussed or talked about in our societies. They're kind of brushed aside. And I think the illegality and the immorality have to come much more to the fore, and it's going to have to be citizens groups that make this happen. But there's more to the story than that. I want to give a military or security perspective for a moment. I think nuclear weapons are incredibly cowardly. How much more cowardly can you be than to sit thousands of miles away from civilian targets and press a button, or give an order to press a button, and then send weapons that destroy indiscriminately and cause so much suffering and death as nuclear weapons? Why don't we recognize and promote the idea of the cowardice of nuclear weapons and what they represent for any military? I think any military that would go along with the idea of nuclear weapons is already branding itself as an extremely cowardly organization, and any country that would do so likewise is demonstrating to the world an expression of high cowardice, or low cowardice, as you wish. Further, nuclear weapons are extremely anti-democratic. They concentrate power. How can we give the power that nuclear weapons could unleash, the 10,000 or so nuclear weapons in the U.S. arsenal? How can we turn that power over to a single individual, which we do? There's no possibility of our Constitution and its provisions with regard to war having any semblance of reality. I mean, they have very little semblance of reality right now, as we know, in relation to the war in Iraq and the Vietnam War and other post-World War II wars. But nuclear weapons, by their very nature, are anti-democratic, terrible concentration of power. So no democracy should feel comfortable with these weapons. And we might ask, whose interests do these weapons serve? In the powerful states, they certainly serve the interests of the corporations that make this $40 billion a year, continue this $40 billion a year, and over the course of the nuclear age in the United States alone, over $6 trillion, an unimaginable amount of money that could have brought such benefits in education, healthcare, shelter, and friendship throughout the world that we've squandered in the terrible nuclear arms race that we've engaged in and that the United States has led at every point in time. But beyond that, do they serve our security interests? I think not. For powerful states, nuclear weapons are something that they can only use at their peril. They can threaten, they can brandish, but they can only use at their great peril, because nuclear weapons used against another nuclear weapon state would bring about retaliation and would be suicidal, and used against a non-nuclear weapon state would be perceived, I believe, should be perceived for the crime which it would be. On the other hand, they are enormously useful as weapons of the weak. And so as long as the strong continue to cling tenaciously to these weapons and make them part of their security strategy, these weapons are available in stockpiles and around the world in the nuclear weapon states for the weak to eventually get their hands on. And when an extremist group like Al-Qaeda, an extremist group does succeed in getting a nuclear weapon or making a nuclear weapon, they will not be in any way influenced by the theory of deterrence. You can't, deterrence, first of all, requires that you locate the party that attacks you, that you be able to locate that party. And it requires rationality, and it requires that your opponent not be suicidal, not be driven to suicidal actions. So I believe that the powerful countries such as the United States are putting themselves at grave risk by continuing their very useless policies of maintaining these weapons, and therefore, even from a strategic perspective, they're acting foolishly and in a way that's very likely to lead to their own demise. And a few nuclear weapons in the hands of extremists that would use them against United States cities, I believe, would destroy this country forever in a way that the United States could not recover from economically, politically, or socially, or culturally. It only would take a few cities. And on the other hand, were we to use these weapons yet again, somehow we managed to do a very good PR job on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it wouldn't be possible to do that a second time. We would destroy ourselves by our own use of these weapons. And I think we have to call these weapons by their names, and their name is omnicidal annihilators. They're nothing more nor less than this. So we need leadership, and we're very lacking in leadership in this country and in most countries throughout the world. And when I say leader, I don't mean just somebody who occupies a role in society, but I mean somebody who exhibits certain characteristics that are needed to move humanity forward in a way of decency and in a way that recognizes human dignity. I think the respect for human dignity is a primary characteristic of a leader. And most people who occupy roles of leadership don't demonstrate that respect for human dignity. So if we're going to reconceptualize nuclear weapons, we also need to reconceptualize leadership. Imagination. We need leaders who can use their imaginations to foresee the likely consequences of their actions. And clearly, in this country, we have leaders that are doctrinaire, but do not foresee don't even see on a relatively short-term basis the consequences of their actions. And thus, if we follow them, we follow like lemmings to our great peril. We need leaders that have vision, that can see a way forward that in which security can be obtained without nuclear weapons and without war, where security can be based on cooperation, friendship, diplomacy, making a potential enemy a friend before they even recognize that they're an enemy. And those changes have to come about by policy, by decent policies, and not by bombing. And finally, we need leaders that reflect courage. The courage to be different, the courage to express their vision in public, the courage to take us in a new direction and not just by inertia follow along the old trodden paths that are leading us over the nuclear precipice. Now, in addition to leadership, we need, I think, an economic campaign. And recently, Norway has set an extremely good example. The country of Norway has divested its accounts, its retirement accounts and the other accounts that the country itself maintains, of all companies that make nuclear weapons. Over $500 million came out of their portfolios, their stock portfolios, getting rid of the companies that are involved in making nuclear weapons. Now, if Norway can do it, why, others can do it as well. Apartheid in South Africa ended because college students on American campuses, among others, understood that there was an economic leverage point, and they rallied and campaigned at their universities for the universities to divest themselves of companies profiting from investments in South Africa that supported apartheid. I think this is an absolutely marvelous idea. I think Norway has set a great example, and I think we should have a major campaign to promote all universities, all major social institutions and country portfolios to divest from the Lockheed Martins, the Raytheons, the Boeings of the world. Just out. Say no economically to these expenditures. Now, I want to mention three things that the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation is doing that might be tools to help in a global effort to abolish nuclear weapons. First, we have the Sunflower newsletter, which is a free monthly newsletter that comes out over by email that is very comprehensive in highlighting major issues having to do with nuclear weapons, nuclear disarmament, nuclear insanity. And we send that now to about 10,000 people, but there's no reason why it couldn't go to 10 million people or hundreds of millions of people. It's the same amount of work to prepare it and to get it out there. So I ask your help in spreading the information, and I also ask your help particularly among the participants here who are so engaged in these issues, to send us your ideas of what should be included in your articles that can also go out in this newsletter. Secondly, we have a Turn the Tide campaign. Turn the Tide in U.S. nuclear policy, and it sends out action alerts, giving people an opportunity to communicate with their congressional representatives, their representatives in government, and in the news media. And these come out regularly and are helpful tools for citizens to engage. And you can find information on both the Sunflower and the Turn the Tide campaign at the wagingpeace.org website. So I encourage you to use those tools and tell others about them. And finally, we have a UC Nuclear Free campaign, University of California Nuclear Free. I think it reflects, in a way, the depth of depravity in our culture that we have one of our great universities in the country, the University of California, providing management and oversight to the nation's nuclear weapons laboratories. I mean, imagine what you would think if you understood that in France or in Britain or in Iran or in any other country in the world, they had a university that was engaged in making weapons of mass destruction. I think we would think that that was, that was a totally inappropriate role for a university to engage in. And I think it's time that the students of the University of California and the people connected to the University of California take a step and demand that their university get out of this business. It would be a great moral triumph, I think, for the university to go back to its roots and get out of this dirty business. I want to close with a quotation from Harold Pinter, who received the Nobel Prize for Literature this year and made a very powerful speech, well worth reading. He said, "I believe that despite the enormous odds which exist, unflinching, unswerving, fierce intellectual determination as citizens to define the real truth of our lives and our societies is a crucial obligation which devolves upon us all. It is in fact mandatory. If such a determination is not embodied in our political vision, we have no hope of restoring what is so nearly lost to us, the dignity of man." And I would submit to you that our fight for a world free of nuclear weapons, our fight to change our thinking about these weapons, is a fight for the dignity of the human species as well as the future of our species and life on this planet. Thank you.